Hello, good evening and welcome. I'm Karima Brown and you're watching Political Exchange, where we unpack Africa's political economy. Somalia's parliament elected a new president of the country's fledgling government on September 10th, a move that members of the international community say is a key step toward the East African nation's transition from a war-torn failed state to a nation with an effective government. To look at whether this optimism is matched by political and security realities on the ground, I'm joined in the studio by Professor Faried Essack from the Center for the Study of Democracy at the University of Johannesburg, as well as Lisa Otto, who is a researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs. Thank you so much for joining us. Professor Essack, let me start with you. This election, is it the baby steps toward long-term political and security stability in Somalia?
Well, I don't want to sound too tentative, but I think that it's part of the baby steps. I think that any move that actually worked as the elections did, although its own limitations, given the fact that AlShabaab didn't participate in the elections, and in fact large parts of the Somalian population did participate in it, it worked. It worked, there was an outcome, and I think that any project that works, even to this limited extent, it contributes in some ways. I do, however, think that some of the impediments are still huge. Whether they're insurmountable or not, that we can talk about later.
Lisa, do you agree the fact that a group as important as AlShabaab did not participate, does it not delegitimize in some senses the poll and neutralize the point that the professor made, or do you share his view?
Well, I certainly share his view. I think that it's the most positive steps that we've seen thus far, but I'm still cautiously optimistic about where Somalia is going, because there's certainly still a lot to be done. With regard to the engagement of AlShabaab, or rather the non-engagement of the group, well, I don't think that they're a legitimate political actor anyway. I mean, in order to engage on a political platform, you need to bring something to the table. You need to be able to talk. So you're hardly going to talk to me when I'm pointing a gun at you.
Professor Essack, do you think that AlShabaab is an illegitimate political actor?
Well, I don't quite know if I agree with you, Lisa. In fact, I don't think I do. I think the one is political legitimacy or moral legitimacy, and generally our societies wouldn't ascribe that kind of legitimacy to people that go around carrying guns, especially if they're not state agents themselves. The truth, though, is that they do occupy a large part of the country. The majority of the country is still under the control of AlShabaab. And so it's not so much about whether one likes them or whether one doesn't like them, whether you think that they're terrorists or whether they're not terrorists. And I don't want to engage in this kind of equivocation or say that they were the equivalent of the ANC or the equivalent of the Irish Republican Army. But the truth is, you know, that throughout the world, yesterday's terrorists did become today's participants in government. And so I think for the long-term stability of Somalia, they are an indispensable element. Let's not forget that the predecessor of the currently elected government, the former prime minister, he himself was engaged in AlShabaab. And so it's a continuous kind of fluctuation in play.
Let me draw the discussion towards the new president, Hassan Sheikh Mohammed. Some people describe him as a political newcomer. He, of course, won the election and he started a new political party in Somalia, Peace and Development. What do we know about him, Lisa? And how credible is he? Will he be able, for example, to command the respect of, you know, the various forces that count in Somali society?
I think he is definitely a newcomer. He's a little bit of a different actor than what we've seen in Somalia before, given that he's an academic and has, you know, quite a strong history in education. So I think we'll be seeing a slightly different kind of politics because of that, given that you know, it's generally dominated by kind of clan politics. Coming to what we know about him, he is a new actor. I don't think all that much is known about him. However, there have been some kind of positive commentary that's come out about him in the last in the last few days, but ultimately it will come down to action, and it will come down to what he's able to do and whether he's able to unify the country.
Now, of course, Kenya is a very key partner and often feels the brunt of violence. We've seen the Kenyan Prime Minister endorse this election and welcome it. Is that a good sign, Professor Essack?
On the whole, yes. I mean, it's not just the Kenyan Prime Minister that has endorsed his election. Also, much of international, particularly Western opinion has endorsed his election. I think the two other things that he brings to the table that are significant is in the context of Somalia, and there's a huge amount of corruption both ways, the resistance by AlShabaab and the government. The guy comes to the table untainted. Very clean person, has significant, comes with his academic background, but also significant experience in developmental NGO work and so on. And so he enjoys that kind of credibility and a solid relationship with the international community. That on the one hand. On the other hand, he is presented as a moderate Islamist. And at the moment, for much of Northern Africa, moderate Islamists are the flavor of the month. But they are also generally, I think we've seen it in Tunisia, we've seen it more specifically in Egypt recently, that moderate Islamists are people that the West, and to that extent Kenya is very much a part of the West, feel that they can do business with. And so yes, whether this moderate Islamism is enough to get the support of AlShabaab, who isn't in government, doesn't have to consider the importance or the technicalities of policy. How do you translate all of this Islamic State ideology stuff into policy? Whether it is enough for AlShabaab, that is an entirely different question. But I do think that it does signify some kind of improvement in the Kenyan-Somalia relationship.
Lisa, the impediments that Professor Essack spoke about earlier, apart from the fact that certain significant groups were kept out of the elections, to your mind, what are those things that need to be in place to engender a more long-term, stability for Somalia?
Well, there are many. I mean, I think
let's isolate the top three.
Okay. Well, I mean, if you look at the kind of political element, I think there's still a long way to go in terms of engaging locals, so local ownership of the process, and that will go also to how the institutions are working, and definitely also these allegations of corruption and ineptness of the political institutions. This will need to be dealt with. Secondly, of course, we can't discount the security concerns. I mean, it's been a huge concern. This comes in the form, of course, of terrorism, and secondly of piracy. And those are two big issues that will need to be addressed. Thirdly, the outstanding issues with regard to Somaliland will certainly also need to be tackled, given that they fancy themselves an independent state, and although they've not been recognized by any country in the world, they're not going to go along with being part of the Somali state. So that will need to be reconciled.
Professor Essack, this idea of Somalia as a failed state has certainly, been entrenched. The kind of images that one associates with Somalia is gun-toting, warlords running around with very little, institutions that can actually create a society where there's stability. This election of this person with an education background, what does it spell for, actually crafting a state out of a place where, in essence, things, were absent for so very long?
I think that on the one hand, one would say that, oh gosh, this guy is an educated guy, this guy is an engineer, he's been engaged with the international community, speaks English fluently and so on. I think that all of this does a lot to invite greater confidence on the part of the international community and the Organization of African and the Africa Union. So I think all of those things are in place. But at the end of the day, one specific individual, there are huge limitations to that person's ability to maneuver. And so there are clan dynamics that's not going to go away. I think there are ideological dynamics that are not going to go away. And of course, I think that I agree with Lisa that it's really a question of how the Somalis among themselves resolve the question. But the truth is that the Horn of Africa is also a significant part of a larger geopolitical game that is being played out there. And many people, including the South African government, have long been insisting that it's actually a problem that the Somalis must sort out among themselves. The intractability of the problem emerges, of course, from the very hard line that AlShabaab has been adopting. And they haven't quite endeared themselves in the territories that they have occupied, given some of the more severe measures of, say, quote-unquote Islamic punishments that they have. So I don't know. I think that the election of Mohammed, I prefer not to use his full surname, which is Sheikh Mohammed. You may just think that he's a religious sheikh of Mohammed. I think that it goes some way. But given the terrible state that Somalia is in at the moment, it's a very, very long way ahead to see how he can put the basic infrastructures in the place back in Somalia back in place.
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, in the absence of proper institutions, issues like corruption, accountability is very difficult to, get or to deal with, because, how do you introduce compliance? How do you get people to buy in? What is the first order of business, for the new Somali president?
Well, I mean, I think it's difficult because he's going to have to be putting out fires, with regards to security, given that there's an ongoing Kenyan incursion. But ideally, he needs to start building institutions. The institutions need to be in place in order for the country to be able to function as a democracy.
Dr. Essack, I want to understand, it's easy to say that it's not the work of an individual, but we do know that individuals play very important roles and they need to inspire. In a place where there's very little to be inspirational about, such as Somalia, what is it about an individual leader's ability that is that extra bit of magic that gets people to buy into an idea? What would the new idea be of a more stable Somalia?
Oh, the South African temptation, a bit of a self-absorbed temptation, is immediately to look for a Mandela kind of figure, okay? But let's ignore, sorry, I sound rather dismissive, the Mandela option at the moment. I think the ability to push ahead while trying to bring along the maximum amount of players who differ with you on the one hand. And so it is, how do you listen to people, not just the people that have won the elections, but both the people. I mean, there were a number of entities who participated in the elections and who lost the elections. How do you make them feel a part of your project? So you build a team of the losers in the elections and the winners in the elections, but a bit more than that. You try to start a second track of diplomacy with all of those who weren't a part of the process at all. And so I think this is the challenge of leadership for Somalia at the moment.
We will have to leave it there. We're going to take a short break, but when we come back, we continue our conversation with Dr. Faried Essack and Lisa Otto on whether Somalia has finally transcended its status as a failed state.